Okay, welcome everyone to the Smooth Brain Society. I am Sahid. Today with me, pretty special episode because I came across this publication online called by a group called Jungle Publics, and I found the names on it. One was Prateek Shankar, the next one was Valerie Navarrete, and the third one was Meghna Sharma in coordination with the Rhode Island School of Design and many other people. And they were talking about something called Planetary Melancholia. Now, the article itself was very confusing, but the name on the article was very familiar to me because he was my high school friend from way back in India, Prateek, and I asked him if he wanted to come on. Well, to be fair, he asked me if he could come on and explain what he was talking about a bit further. Uh, and I said yes, why not? Because I found the concept very interesting, although also in some places very confusing. Because story from way back in school, he was one of the smartest people around. So smart that he was actually awarded by the city as, and he's making eyes at me to not say anything further. So I won't. But uh, bec- because because of how incredible he was back in the day, his writing style was also very fancy. So I thought I'd get him on to kind of explain what he actually is trying to say to for us common folk. Um, and I'll give you a little bit more of an introduction of him. So after school, he went on and has a degree in architecture from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, and then a master's in cultural theory and analysis from the Rhode Island School of Design. He's not alone. Like I said, the other person on this publication was Valerie Navarrete, and she holds a master's from Rhode Island School of Design and Global Arts and Culture, where her research explored the transmission of colonial trauma at the US Mexico border through epigenetics and weaving. Having said that, before that, she graduated from Yale University with two bachelors, one in art with the concentration in painting, and the other one in molecular cellular development biology. Those seem like the two wildest things to co-major in together, but she did that. She's won multiple fellowships. I saw a whole list on her LinkedIn and on her website. She was the illustration editor of the Yale Daily News. Yeah, and she's worked at Harvard Medical School as well. So yeah, both really incredible people on, although very young. So thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks
Thank you for
for
the
having
intro.
us.
That was really kind. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So let's before we even get to the article, let's talk about and what you're thinking about. Let's talk about what Jungle Publics is because it's titled under Jungle Public. So if you guys could explain what that is, what you're trying to do, and then we can go from there.
Um, yeah. Uh, Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the really warm introduction and for having us on today. Jungle Publics really was just initially was just a place for Val and I to sort of put some of these strange discussions we've been having for a few years down on paper. But I think the process of doing it, we've sort of attracted a certain sort of community of people. I think we wrote it with this intention of trying to be as intentionally interdisciplinary. And I know a lot of people try to say that they're interdisciplinary and they're trying to challenge sort of academic censure in some way. But our intention was to really see if we can do this in a way that's actually generative and actionable. It does end up being a place where some of it is harder to understand than others. But our sense was that in trying to get all of these different sort of knowledge systems to engage with each other, we might be able to create sort of multiple entry points into the discussion. So even if some parts of it are illegible to you, other things would be legible to you. So it gives you sort of a sort of middle ground. And I mean, we call them nexus literatures. The idea being that these intersectional pieces that potentially might help you sort of access other things. Now, how that works in theory, we don't know. We'll see over time. But we did a few pieces, and we've since sort of expanded our ambitions. We've now expanded to like a community of 25 people from all over the world, all kinds and shapes and sizes of people from all kinds of backgrounds, and we've realized that there might be something really interesting in trying to explore how knowledge and culture are produced and how, I mean, a lot of cultural production has colonial origins. We know that in, I mean, in something as simple as the modern university system and stuff like that. But thinking about how we might be able to not not sort of necessarily decolonize these institutions, but just uh, conceptualize alternative models for cultural production altogether, an alternative model for an institution that does this sort of thing. We don't know what that is. I mean, so Jungle Publics really for us is an exploration of what that might look like. Could we sort of, I mean, we're not trying to find a seat on the current sort of tables of high knowledge making. Our idea is we want to make our own table, and we want to see what that looks like if you actually do it from the ground up and do it in a way that brings together voices that you typically wouldn't hear, or puts voices in conversation that typically aren't put in conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Prateek gave like probably the most raw like core of what we're trying to do here. I just wanted to add like I think in these beginning phases what has been really exciting for us is again amassing this group of artists and scholars who have all these different disciplinary knowledges and learning from one another. We've hosted a few like seminars and conversations with one another, and they're small and intimate, but like it'll go on for like 2 3 hours. Like someone has to end it because we end up getting into it so easily and like falling down these rabbit holes in other people's research and like having something to say because our research is somehow tangential. So I think because of that chemistry that we witnessed, it sort of was, I don't know, a sign that maybe this we're going in the right direction and there is some value in expanding what began as just a publication in our eyes and like amassing this group. And maybe it could be something that um, is a lot broader than the current institutionalized models that we see when we think of like academia. But yeah, that's where we're at right now with Jungle Publics.
Nice. Well, before we get to the actual paper, then I'll ask you, what do you think are the next steps for it to grow further? I really like the idea of building sort of a community from the ground up. I like the idea of being as inclusive as possible because I've had podcasts which talk about how exclusionary sometimes academia can be. How we had Mehmet Orhan on from Normandy University in Paris. Uh, in Paris, in France, sorry, who said who was talking about elitism in academia and how very specific people only ever get published and how hard it is for research papers, especially from the global south, to get voices or be heard. And what you guys are doing seems very good for things like that. And so therefore I was wondering like where do you guys see yourself going in the next like near and long term future?
I guess that's the big question. Um, our sort of initial thinking around this has been we've sort of got the community together to think about what these different sort of models of engagement and dissemination would look like. And I think one sort of conclusion we came to is that we don't necessarily need to invent anything or like reinvent the wheel in any way. There actually already exist alternative models of knowledge production, and some of them are intrinsically sort of meant to be small in scale and very intimate. So our sense was instead of being this sort of new, enlarged, encompassing logic that's trying to accumulate power in the sort of in the sense that the power you get when you make knowledge, we were thinking of ourselves as could we sort of become this like connecting tissue between these different knowledge making movements? If you think about something as simple as indigenous storytelling practices in South America, or even like day-to-day folk singing in Tamil Nadu, which are carrying a sort of ancestral knowledge to them, or and knowledge about the land and the relationship to the land. Um, And if you scale that up to, the memes and the new sort of, streaming logics that some of the younger populations utilize to make knowledge, these are all legitimate. Like if you think about social movements right now, all of them are empowered by this really quick, easy to access modes of knowledge. So at the core, it's really not about inventing anything. It's really about trying to find a way to create sustainable pathways for um, connection and cross pollination, basically. And that's what we're trying to think about. And we have a few things in lined up. One being a residency that we're planning with some partners in Kenya, with the idea of sort of tapping into arts and culture practitioners and possibly even inviting other sort of disciplines, scientists and policymakers to do effectively a residency with no product in it. I mean, typically a residency is you work on something together and then you have a show or something, but we don't really care about you making something as much as the process of sitting together and engaging in these processes. So I guess our next steps are really about thinking about these different ways that we could get people to convene and see how that might translate into some sort of connecting tissue.
Yeah. Nice. All right. Shall we get into your first publication of sorts, into Planetary Melancholia? So maybe you could give us a little overview of why you thought this would be something to write about. Yeah, to begin with, and then we can go from there. So maybe the overarching why, the background to it.
Yeah, so why don't Prateek start out with his, because it originally was first kind of just like an article Prateek pitched that made sense for him to write. But then it really expanded, and that's when I got involved in it more. But I'll have Prateek kind of explain what it originally started as, and then maybe jump in when that expansion starts off.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I guess the whole thing started with so until very recently I worked as a strategic design fellow at a place called the Center for Complexity at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is also where Val and I met. And the Center for Complexity is trying to they're trying to sort of tackle these sort of big picture problems, right? We're in this moment where there are these like really massive overarching crises, and it seems like our institutional infrastructure just can't keep up. And one of the things we kept encountering was that in any of these sort of large forums you go into where you're trying to discuss things like climate action or social justice, there's this really strong, palpable sense of helplessness and grief that's addressed to some extent, but that's always there. And that it always sort of leads to this moment where everybody just feels so defeated that they're like, even if we did something, nothing's going to change. And there's sort of this like overarching gloom. And we figured maybe we should think about this. Maybe we should think about this sort of epidemic of grief, especially after the pandemic. And how that might be playing into a lot of these processes. And that's kind of where it started. One of the frames we've been working on and trying to make popular at the Center for Complexity and now at other places that I've also collaborating with, like Dark Matter Labs and Politics for Tomorrow in Berlin, is this idea of the planetary. And the planetary is not a new idea. Gayatri Spivak proposed this decades ago as sort of an alternative to the sort of totalizing logics of relating to the planet, like globalization or internationalism and stuff like that. With the idea being that can we decenter the human experience when we think about the planet? So it isn't necessarily about globalization and that all these countries are communicating. That the planetary as this like much more complex, entangled system of human and more than human processes that actually make the planet what it is, and there are and actually sort of define the way it functions, right? So when we think about globalization, we think about trade and we think about the internet, but we don't really think about the fact that all of these systems rely on the land, they rely on the climate, they rely on these ecological and socio-ecological processes, which we completely dismiss. So that's kind of where we started approaching the idea. Just like when we think about this idea of the planetary, and Spivak has this, she takes this one step further. She has a concept called planetarity, which she frames as being like an active protest against anything that is totalizing. Because ultimately, if you really want to think about a relationship to the planet, we don't really know, right? Like we don't really know what makes the planet work. We have our best guesses and our different sort of, we have scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge and some sort of implicit knowledge about how this works, but we fundamentally don't know. There is a mystery to how the world works. And I think encompassing that mystery into a relationship to the planet is important. And that kind of is how we were thinking of the planetary. So the thought was, can we take this idea of this like deep entanglement that the planet functions inside and use it to think about grief and use it to think about this epidemic of grief? And the more we thought about it, we came to the conclusion that there actually is something very unique about how personhood is constituted today, and how that personhood itself is affected by these varying degrees of exposure to all kinds of crises. And if you think about the speed at which we communicate right now, there's a way in which in the past a crisis would happen somewhere and then you would get to know about it in a few days. And you'd usually get to know about it by the point where there's some sort of action being taken. But right now we see everything happening in real time. There is responses to it in real time. There is a rejection of it in real time. You see people denying the narratives in real time. Excuse me. And there's a way in which you never really have enough time to process what's going on. And I think it's this, we came to the conclusion that it isn't really just grief. It's this massive, overwhelming, like network of feelings of just being burdened by all these projections of people trying to make sense and partially making sense and then competing with their different understandings of the situation that leave all of us feeling really confused. And the strangeness of it all is that given how alienating neoliberal society is by design, right, it keeps forcing it on us that we need to be individuals without realizing that you can't really be an individual without like a social, without there being a social model. You're sort of stuck in this place where on one level, you want to be an independent individual, but you also really want community, but there really aren't places for that sort of community anymore. We don't really have public spaces, and this is sort of across the world right now. It's getting harder and harder to find common places, like even a park where people sort of engage with each other. These are fewer and far between. So you end up being drawn to the digital sphere to do exactly that. I think these digital spaces are highly addictive by design. So now we crave community, but we don't get the sort of space and time and intimacy that you would have in typical community spaces, while also participating in this like high spectacle, high attention grabbing, discursive environment, right? So we're all left sort of fractured, I think, in some sense. And that's kind of where the idea started, about this sort of strange feeling that we're all encompassing, and also at the same time feeling in different degrees. And that's something I want to get into later. But and then as we started unpacking the idea, Val came on board because she has a biology and a background in molecular biology, and another friend of ours, Pratna Sham, who's a therapist. The idea was, can we sort of bring these different disciplines together and put them in conversation? And then Val came up with some really cool things.
Yeah, that was. It's funny because it always starts this way if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. So here, like when we plan an article, it's like we think we're gonna write about the entire world, and then we have to get writing, and then we're just like stuck. Like it becomes, I think talking about the process itself is really important because kind of like what you gauge here, it's when you read it without having, maybe you're not in the room in the conversation when we're writing it. And maybe if you don't have the same background. It could be an intimidating piece. And I think we knew that when we were writing it, and that was something we want to work on later. But like, that is all to say that since this was our first larger form essay, we were super eager about getting every thought we had on paper, which is why it's very long and intimidating and like just trying to stretch all corners of the world. Of course, there are holes. But yeah, I was brought on because a lot of my research, spawning even from undergrad, was very situated in this narrative about expanding the environment beyond like what we see. It is not just like the trees and the grass and the material. It's like this second layer that is causing health disparities, that is like making certain people die of COVID over others, and it's a disproportionate race like disparity. All of these things that I was intrigued by when I was in undergrad. And I bring up this background because I think it's important that you don't just land on these ideas without having done research maybe in something seemingly unrelated, and then you stumble upon this idea. And for me, it happened during the pandemic when we were seeing all of our institutions fail. And kind of like what Prateek alluded to, we had like these third spaces and senses of community were gone, and we realized none of us really had that as much as we thought. Technology seemed to be the thing we were turning to, but then I don't know about you guys, but I became sick of it because like Prateek said, we were witnessing trauma every single day on whatever news app you had, whatever social media app you had, and it's tiring. I mean, like we were not trained, programmed, evolved to be dealing with this amount of stress and trauma at the rate that we are. And when I realized that, and I had to take a break when I was writing my thesis for undergrad, I think a lot of those ideas were transferring into what I was interested in at the time. Just thinking about, okay, well then why is it that we're all suffering? Like there has to be a reason. And yeah, like this idea, this article that is like very expansive, I think transpired because we all had that sort of awakening at some point in our research and our careers at the time, our research, and came together. And when all three of us had a conversation about it on Zoom, and we were kind of presenting to each other our own research backgrounds, we started to see this connection about the material and the immaterial and that interaction. So here you studied epigenetics, so you know that it's really hard to describe to someone who has this notion of what a genetic predisposition is. Like it just feels like something that's written and it's there, so you're going to develop XYZ. But what if I were to tell you, you might be predisposed to this if you're in the right environment at the right time because your grandparents were in that similar environment and were stressed out, therefore they had to develop a mechanism to read your genes a certain way. Like it is very hard to explain that, which is why I think when I was at RISD, a lot of what I was trying to do myself is like communicate it in a way using linguistics of like art, which feels very tangible and easy to manipulate the material and the immaterial at the same time. But yeah, so when I came on board to this project, I was like, okay, I think I know how we can all combine this. And all three of us had a discussion. I wrote a bit about like epigenetic landscapes, sort of just giving a lit review of what that immaterial material interaction could be as it relates to grief and trauma, which are themselves very abstract terms and not everyone is understand, and frankly are pretty untranslatable words that are heavy with meaning but like light in any sort of definition. And so for us it's a challenge to talk about these things, but because we can feel them and sense them, that was like the biggest task of the piece. But yeah, I think manipulating these disciplines that we all came with really helped create the closest we could do at the time with the tools we had, an overview. It's not a solution at all. It is simply sort of just a review, like a literature review of everything that we know, and little bridges to connect those little islands of things that we know. But yeah, it is like a lengthy piece, and at some point I would be curious to know what parts maybe you were most confounded by, Sahir, because that is helpful to us to know what parts we probably need to translate better in future writings. But yeah, that was sort of the summary of how we got it all together.
Oh, that was really good. Uh, there's so many things which I would want to touch on because you mentioned so many things, obviously. Uh, first, I'll start with the trauma point. Trauma is very interesting because depending on who you ask and the context, it also means very different things. So if you ask someone like a brain surgeon or someone working as a neuropsychologist, you're talking about when you talk about trauma, you want something which has actually really impacted the brain and you can like see it on CT scans and MRI scans and stuff versus uh, how generally we speak about trauma versus if you talk to a psychiatrist, how they talk about trauma. Um, so when we throw around the word trauma, it's also very different about how people understand what you mean by it.
Mhm.
Um, uh, uh, as talking about your way of explaining epigenetics, I quite like it. That was the one part of the paper which I could understand without any second guessing because obviously I've studied it for so long. Uh, I guess for people who don't get what it is, my favorite example is to go to this one about the Dutch hunger winter because I feel when you talk about intergenerational impacts of mental health issues, so like by stress, by alcoholism, so and so, blah blah blah. I feel it's a bit more nebulous, but when you talk about something like obesity or something like diabetes, it's a lot easier because it's more measurable.
Mhm.
I quite like the Dutch hunger winter example. So for people who don't know, there was a there was a famine in the Netherlands caused a bit by World War II, caused a bit by a few other issues. There was very limited access to food, and what they noticed is in the generations after that. So the kids who weren't born then, the gen but the next generation who were born after the famine was over, they started seeing higher obesity rates in them or higher rates of eating disorders in them. And one of the reasons for it is because due to epigenetics, this idea that their parents kind of trained their bodies for a limited amount of food or lack of resources. But then when they all of a sudden got abundance of resources, their kids weren't like genetically, they had the genes, but they weren't programmed as well to deal with the abundance of food. That's one very simple example. It's obviously way more complex than that, but I kind of like to use it because it's more measurable. It's more
Yeah.
in people's heads. You can get the idea of obesity or diabetes around a lot better than you can that, oh my God, because your grandparents had to go through this, you're stressed now, or you're not built to deal with this kind of stress now. It's, uh, yeah. Uh, you mentioned the planetary. Um, I wanted to ask, how is this different from when we talk about climate anxiety or things like that? Because a lot of the anxiety I feel is when we talk about climate anxiety, we talk about issues we see regarding climate change in certain ways and how that's affecting people's mental and physical health as well. We call it climate anxiety, but you also include physical health as well because different temperatures cause rise to different diseases, which were probably not existent in that area before. Um, so on and so forth. So, how is this idea of your idea of planetary melancholy different or growing, building upon that idea?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, climate anxiety was, I think, one of the first ideas I was looking into. And my concern with framings like that is that in general, right? Like in the public consciousness, there's this sense that the climate breakdown is going to be like the movie 2012, like suddenly everything's going to explode, the sun's going to burn us down. But really, that's not what it is. It's different processes happening at different speeds, and it's going to lead to like, increasing heat leads to food shortages in one part of the world, which leads to, civil unrest there. There are glaciers melting, pathogens in the air, potential for new kinds of health risks, right? Which over time could like destabilize economic pathways, which could lead to, these sort of transnational resource conflicts, which would lead to people actually dying. We're seeing that happening right now. Right? The energy crisis is leading to a moral crisis, right, and really a genocide. And so the thing with the framing climate anxiety is it makes you think that you're feeling bad because it's getting hot, but it's I guess it's worth talking about the climate crisis itself as being not just about the climate, but it's actually a deeper sociological sort of condition. That it's slowly going to multiply, and it is, into all of these different layers that aren't necessarily related to the climate, but everything else. Right? It's going to affect all of these different processes. So if you're feeling a certain alienation already, it gets hotter outside. We spend more time indoors, right? And now we spend even more time digitally, and that leads to another sort of paradigm. And you can sort of keep going on and on into these different down these different sort of systemic logics. And also, we know that all of this affects certain social groups, discriminated populations far more than others, right? And that's the thing with climate anxiety. It seems to conflate the experience of watching these crises from a distance from actually being the first to experience it, right? If you are in the tropical world where you're experiencing massive heat spikes, or if you're in a coastal community that's actually experiencing flooding, the framing of climate anxiety doesn't differentiate that experience of like fear because you're actually going to lose your home to sitting at home and watching it on the internet, right? And I feel like adding that nuance was something we thought was critical, which kind of brought us to the question of planetary melancholia.
No, very nice. Uh, I I I also, while you were saying that, I also remembered something which one of my previous guests had said. So Marianne Radon works at the Institute in New York, and she was talking about how people perceive pain differently after uh have based on like which climate they've grown up in. Um, not just that. So they've taken twins. This is a study in America. They've taken twins who've had very different lifestyles, and apparently their subconscious pain perception is very different. So, and so your socioeconomic status, where you live, your climate, so and so, all affect these things, which was very interesting. Um, and yeah, I wanted to just point that out. It's pretty cool that the way you guys are talking about is kind of bringing back almost all the other episodes which people have spoken about to me, and they're kind of like combining it at the same time because what you guys are talking about is so broad.
That's cool. I mean, that's why we did this, right? Like to attract everyone. Like come to us.
It's like throw your net out real wide and see what you get.
Yeah.
But also to that point, I think it's worth noting that, I mean, there's a way in which the climate crisis is disproportionately going to affect um, certain populations more than others, right? Like it's not Europe is going to experience the fallout of the climate crisis, right? People in the tropics in the next 10 years, if you don't bring the temperature down, are literally going to die of heat, right? And increasing sort of water shortages and the glaciers melting, right? Which is not to say that there may not be specific climatological things happening in Europe. It's just that there's a disproportionality to this. And if you think about um, cases historically of like mines being built around populations of color predominantly in the West, you'll see that the climate crisis is only going to make this worse. So if you're trying to do, I mean, people talk about the transitioning to electricity like it's going to save us all from everything, but even transitioning to electricity requires us to mine critical minerals like lithium or nickel or cobalt, and all of that is seeing these historic labor relations, these violent labor relations get exaggerate even more, right? So now you have these horrible, basically almost enslaved labor processes in Congo where people are digging for cobalt with their bare hands because there's such a high demand for it. And nobody's really kept thinking about safety measures or anything like that because historically the West has never offered the same standards of safety to the quote unquote third world, right? So I think about this all the time, right? When I was in the US, you'd get these weather warnings about a cyclone approaching or something, or like it's going to be a heavy, like a thunderstorm today, and I'm just like, this is an evening of rain in India. Like you guys have a very high, like you're, like you guys don't understand what a thunderstorm really is, right? And like I think about this all the time because it does translate to many different things, and we know this even in things like the ways in which the pain of women is typically, I mean, is disproportionately measured, right? You assume that women can handle more pain, and that Black women especially can handle even more pain, and then we get these like reflected in how our healthcare is provided, which is the point actually that Val brought up. And I don't know if you want to say something more about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was gonna kind of draw out even more too and like talk to that point, but just the fact that this climate crisis is really just bringing to surface things that have been brewing for so long. And that is simply because now the first world, or whatever you want to call it, is now being somewhat impacted by it. So as soon as like there are some effects that can be perceived, now it's a crisis. As if people dying in these like terrible labor conditions that Prateek we're talking about were not already terrible to begin with, and we're not something that is still going on that people are able to ignore and be complacent about, because frankly that's the way that things are designed here, that you don't really see what's behind the mirror, and yet you're just like taking part in it. And now that things are starting to emerge, because even if we aren't going to be the ones that are like at the site of, I mean, not we, but just like a broader we of like people in the first world are not going to be at the site of say the tragedies that will happen later on with climate crises. Like there are going to be refugees, and there are going to be other supply demand, like things that aren't perceived now will be brought to light, and we will have to deal with it then. People have been saying that for many, many years, and it is interesting to see that it's almost like it's just a self-fulfilled prophecy at this point. It is something that has been going on for so many years that of course it's going to happen. But yeah, going back to what Prateek was saying, like a lot of this I think is simply what we decide to privilege in uh high level education, high level institutional knowledges. What we decide is worth studying, how we design what we know and think, specifically in academia. Um, and I think, like, yeah, no discipline is safe from this. I think all disciplines have major blind spots that overlap. And then you start to see a pattern when you zoom out a bit, which is, I think, something else that we're trying to do in this essay. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of women's pain as well, or even I was just having a conversation the day with Megna about like birth control in general, um, and how like it has become the women's responsibility, and it was like this empowering tool at the time. It was advertised that way, and now a lot of women, there's like sort of this counter movement that's like, actually no, the real power is getting off the pill, because people are realizing all these insane hormonal downstream effects that have not been studied because they have not been made relevant or seen as like something worth studying, but are drastically changing women's lives and even their fertility problems, susceptibility to hyperglycemia, like the list goes on, and because the range of symptoms are so broad, there has been, and of course it is. I mean, if you learn or study science, you know how insane hormones are. Imagine pumping fake hormones inside your body. Like, shit's gonna change, of course. And everybody's different. Like, it just seems like a no-brainer, but because the fast solution at the time was just to like pour that responsibility onto the woman, and people didn't really feel the need to study those downstream effects, and even to this day don't really care to. Or just maybe because also it's too expensive. There's grant money involved. You have to involve the NIH. Like there's so many red tape that it's almost dismissed immediately. So it's kind of like choose to suffer on the pill if you are, or get off of it, and then the responsibility is still sort of made on you, because now we're going to make abortion illegal in certain states. It's just like there is no concession here. But then again, like, what it goes all back to is like what we're privileging in these spaces. Like, who are we privileging in these spaces? And like, all of this knowledge has been known, but what is the knowledge that is actually true and perceived in the public that has the most power? But yeah, that's my mini rant about that, to add on to Prateek's info.
No, I know this is a bit off topic, but stretching further, and you would have done research, so you've seen so many papers, even animal models, even preclinical animal models, where they only use male mice or male rats. They do not look at female differences in like the female rats. So I use male and female because we're only talking about the XY chromosome at this point. But you see that if you're not even looking at these differences, and if you're not even looking at how hormones can affect certain drugs, whatever, what do you have? What really do you have? You're basing it off almost only male studies, only men being looked at, and then you're trying to devise things. That does not relate to birth control, but it relates to so many other drugs.
Oh
It
no,
relates
yeah.
to so many. I think the shooting pain in the left arm, for example, for heart attacks, it doesn't happen. It happens way more in men than it does in women. So a lot of uh women heart attacks aren't diagnosed correctly because they don't have the same symptoms. For example, because it wasn't studied as well, and now like more recently, there's more papers coming out. But for God knows how long, it wasn't. I I remember my colleague or my senior writing an entire review about the serotonin research on serotonin, and how I think she looked at over 100 something papers, and only 4 or 5 ever did anything with looking at female rats or female mice or anything to that. So it's so it was so
Yeah.
disproportionate for so long.
And you know
Like,
what? That's so crazy you bring that up, because I actually confronted my, like, I worked at a lab for a year, as you mentioned, and when I was working there, I confronted my postdoc about it, because I was curious. I was like why are we not like also utilizing female mice in our study? Because we also were only using male mice. And his explanation, which is true, I think, which is why, I mean, I can't speak for every lab, but I think is majority why, is that it's too expensive to track a female mouse's cycle, and to predicate how
yeah.
because hormones, again, are crazy things and change your body, and they fluctuate for women on like the 28-day cycle. Like, every woman knows this because they experience it. But
And for a mice,
because it's not
for a mouse or for a rat, it's 4 days. Just to say,
4 days.
For a mouse or for a rat,
which
it's 4
honestly,
days. So you have to track those fluctuations.
Yeah, which honestly feels like even you saying that, way easier to track it itself, but still is like so out of the way for most like researchers, and just too complicated. And because of that, it is just eradicated altogether, because perhaps there is more funding involved in doing so. But yeah, you bring up this point that maybe we could also talk about, is that something I've been thinking about is this term post-humanist, which is basically thinking about a world designed for beings that are not human, like non-human entities. So thinking about how like a tree experiences the world and designing something outside of that, which feels like a very abstract concept. But when I first heard of post-humanism, my interpretation was kind of what we're talking about now. I'm like, in some ways, like, post-humanism is just including female mice into the studies. Like, that is post-humanism, because right now the human that all of our drugs are predicated on are male driven, or like, that's just like one example of it. But like, who is encompassing human right now? And the fact that we're having these conversations about post-humanism in the environment is so important. But it does feel like a far dream when we're still like asking for the bare minimum. Like, there's just this gap that like we should be doing this and this, but we haven't even gotten to an inclusive human. We can't agree on what that is.
Yeah, if I could just jump into that, I mean, to that point, there's this way in which, right, like, okay, cool. We don't offer, we treat certain populations as being non-human more than others, right? And kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about like these varying definitions of trauma, and there's varying definitions across disciplines. But like if you think about trauma as just like a fluctuation or like, sorry, a dysregulation from some baseline state of health, like it's interesting to think about how that baseline state of health is actually not the same for different people, right? Like I think I'm just going to go there. There's, like white fragility has these models where you would think that there is far less tolerance for pain in these systems, right? And you see a lot more outrage. And this is a mass generalization. I'm not saying all white people are like this, but I just feel like populations of color have historically been shown to be far more resilient to pain and to all sorts of these crises, right? So in that case, like trauma itself is not a stable sort of state. Dysregulation itself is not a stable state because certain states of dysregulation, some people actually, it's the norm and in fact find it completely, seem to function completely fine, but other people don't seem to accept it, right? And I think it's interesting to think about how exactly we choose to medicate or resolve some of these issues, right? Because like, what is the baseline we're trying to use? The medical industry. So there's this thing you're talking about male mice, but I'm also thinking about like consumer markets and how that plays out, right? Like what sorts of medicines are people actually buying? How much of the medicine are people trying to buy? Also, like thinking about the history of pain medication with like the Sacklers and stuff, we already know the entire sort of um, added layer of non-medical, just pure marketing that went into proving to you that you have pain and that you need to be having more and more, right? And now we see that in the opioid crisis. And I'm sure there are others that can speak more to that. But even that tells you that there's no stable measure for pain, right? So what exactly are we solving for? And if you sort of extend that metaphor to the planetary, and if you think of the climate crisis as the planet experiencing trauma, the planet experiencing a state of dysregulation, what is the baseline we want to get to? And you'll realize that there's no straight answer to it, right? Like it actually depends on what is the baseline. Is the baseline predicated on you being able to survive in the future? And what does that survival look like, right? Like, this survival a healthy lifetime? I mean, a healthy lifetime used to be 60 years a long time ago, and now there are a bunch of people who want to live forever, right? Like, what is exactly is a healthy lifetime, and what exactly is sustainable? My sense is, and this is why I think thinking about something in the planetary frame is useful, is that instead of thinking about these is in terms of individual um, experiences, instead of thinking about this as causal things, that something happened, somebody felt pain, they felt this much pain, it's far more interesting and probably useful to think about it in relational terms. If even right now in our conversation, we understand that the amount of pain that men can typically handle versus the amount of pain women can typically handle, thinking also of the fact that, women literally, their bodies are designed to forget the pain they experience when they have babies because it's that much pain. Like, you have like a biological system that's like helps you sort of forget about it, right? We already know that it's not proportionate. But if you sort of focusing on the fact that they have more pain and they have less pain, if you think about the relation, I think that gives you a far more useful metric, because the differential in that relationship gives you a far larger, more encompassing picture of the pain spectrum, of the trauma spectrum itself. And that might give us actually more useful data to respond to it, is my sense. You guys are the scientists, so you tell me what you do with that data.
I think there's a little bit of a difference between the pain you feel and the pain you actually the pain you express, right? So there's also this thing of shut up and get on with it. So you don't necessarily express certain pains, even if you're feeling it. So I think there's two levels of measurement, which from a scientific hat, if you put it on, you kind of want to see how much the brain is actually lighting up, how much the neurons are actually firing in terms of pain, um, versus how much the person's actually saying, how much they feel, how much they're trying to control what they feel, how much they and yeah, that's what I was talking about. If you want to listen to Marianne Redan's episode, because she speaks a little bit to it, where she talks about the difference between how men and women express pain versus how they seem to feel pain when the same level of shock is given to them, or the same level of kind of, they try to induce the same amount of pain through various things. And also, it's not just that. Now we're talking about physical pain, but then we're also talking about the emotional pain of like loss or grieving, and that's, those systems are different, and that adds another layer to one. How would you measure it scientifically, right? I'm not going to like go into a room and tell, oh, I killed your kids or something like that, and be like, see how they react. It's a bit sketchy if you do things like that. So you need to you need to it's also a question of how you want to measure these things, what you're looking for. And yeah, I think the systems involved are also slightly different as opposed to just pure physical pain. And yeah, because we're talking about a whole, we're generally talking about like the mental health issue. Yeah, there's of course physical issues, but when we're talking about planetary melancholia, climate anxiety, and so on, we're talking about the more nebulous emotional pain and anxiety around it. And of course, as you mentioned, there's a lot of physical pain of like if you are drowning and things, but or if you have a mind collapse on you, there's a lot of physical pain there. But we're talking we're talking kind of a bit of both. And when we're talking about the emotional side of it, I think it's a lot harder. And sorry, Val wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just okay. Yeah, first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit more about like the emotional pain. It is real. I think there's just like a fundamental flaw in like scientific method. Like it helps in so many ways, of course, to create drugs. It has been fabulous. That's not the word I want to use, but it has been doing its thing. We have been seeing an eradication of diseases that have killed like thousands of people, millions of people in the past through vaccinations. We saw what it did with COVID. And I'm not like, none of what we're saying is to discount the scientific method or like the miracles of like science and what it has brought to us. But I do think that there is just this inherent flaw when it comes to these really ambiguous terms like pain, physical and emotional. I actually read Empire of Pain, which was that crazy Bible level book about the Sacklers, which was insane. It blew my mind. I highly recommend to anyone because you see how far the rabbit hole goes. But I think I wanted to talk a bit more about the emotional because that's kind of what at least I was trying to focus on, and what we were focusing a bit more on, I noticed in our article as well. But just thinking about how, and we had like one of our other colleagues, Lily Manycolor, she hopped on and she kind of shit on the fact that we were talking so much about like scientific methods, which like makes sense because to her, she's like, she focuses a lot on like indigenous wisdom, rituals, practices. She herself is indigenous. So when she read it, she's like, we've been saying this shit for so many years. Like of course, like you guys are just catching up now. And she's so right. Like there's this term called susto, which translates to roughly like fear, which is a term that was used in Nahua Latinx like communities and indigenous practices in Mexico. And it's basically it talks about the fact that you might experience a certain fright at some point in your life, and if it becomes an unresolved or like ignored thing or emotion or memory, it will materialize as a disease later on in your life. And that is something, and that has been sort of a hallmark of the way that they deal with public health or community health, because public health to them was, and to a lot of other indigenous groups, I can't really speak for all of them, but for the ones that I think I've sort of read about, there is this idea of like community, not just within each other and their families, but like the earth, the environment, the status of each other's well-beings. There's like that synergy, that community spirit that is the public health. Public health now is not really that, right? I feel like public health has had its issues from the very beginning, when we decided to use cartography and quantify things, because a lot of public health is not quantifiable. In some ways it is, but when it comes to these sort of things like these ambiguous terms of trauma and emotional well-being, and how those things have manifested in COVID rate susceptibility to these metabolic diseases, that is not quantifiable. Just like the downstream stuff that we're seeing, that is the disease itself, is quantifiable. So I think that's where public health sort of has that major flaw. I don't know exactly how to fix it, but I think that is just something that we should note and be aware of as we move forward, in trying to even like create advancements within that field. But yeah, that was all I was going to say about that.
That was very interesting. I like that part, and you would be very interested in this because New Zealand is, of course, a hotbed for things like this, considering unlike most indigenous communities, which were almost wiped out completely during colonialism, Maori had a treaty on which New Zealand was built. So New Zealand was built as a bicultural society. Of course, all the other things, yada yada yada, of them being disenfranchised, they're being imprisoned for everything. Literally for speaking Te Reo Maori, they were imprisoned at one point in the 70s. So they've been mistreated horribly. But having said that, because of the framework of the treaty and what New Zealand was built upon, and over the past, I want to say across my lifetime, it's become like Maturanga Maori is what they call it. It's like Maori knowledge, or that has come more into the mainstream in terms of use for things. Maori-led research has become a big thing, more so than when I first started uni. So I started uni in 2012. It wasn't a thing. I think 5% of the New Zealand population spoke Te Reo then. And then now, come 2024, which is 12 years later, I think it's something like 20% of the New Zealand population can speak Te Reo, which is a big step forward. Auckland University people wrote a letter saying that Maori knowledge is not real science. And there was this huge uproar and backlash for it because against the people who penned that. One of my guests from the early podcast, I think my 5th episode or so, was Dr. Tianea, who led the charge against it. She was a Maori researcher who led the charge against the Auckland University researchers who said that Maturanga Maori isn't real knowledge or real science. And I feel like the science community sometimes, or like the academic community sometimes, becomes very gated in what they allow and what they don't allow. And if it's not their method, then it's not correct, which is not true because so many things keep getting revised, keep getting redacted, keep getting built upon. And that's the whole point, right? At least in my head, the whole point of science is you try and you improve. And if new ideas come, in this case, ancient ideas come up, you try them and you see what's good, bad, and so on. But because we're running out of time, like we've been recording for nearly an hour, I feel we should ask about a few of the other key points which grabbed me in your article, and I'll get you guys to like quickly like run through those ideas, if that's okay, as opposed to like a conversation which we've been having so far, just so that we can cover a few more points for everybody listening. So one which I wanted to ask, the first thing which I wanted to ask about was this idea of ambiguous loss. You guys talk about it quite a bit, but I didn't understand all of what I kind of got the idea, but not really. So if you could explain that a bit further, that would be nice. And then I'll point to the other couple of things which we can talk about.
Yeah, I can speak to that really quickly. I encountered this term for the first time in a podcast by Pauline Boss. And I'm not sure where she gets the idea from, but the idea is simply this, right? Like, typically, if you think about just any kind of sort of trauma, or you sort of have a source of the trauma. Usually, you try to, either if it's a psychological thing, you go, if you sit in, like, if you think about typical therapy processes, you sit and you think about that moment of trauma, you process it, you think about the fallout, you think about all of these like downstream effects, and then you come to some sort of resolution, right? Or in more literal terms, like, typical revenge tales, somebody killed my dad, I killed that dude, resolution, right? I know what caused the trauma, right? I know this is exactly what caused the pain. what happens with something like the climate crisis and all of these other crises that are like folded into that, and because you can see that even in the politics that's emerging now, is that it's hard to pinpoint a location and it's hard to make sense of what exactly will help, right? We don't really know. I mean, the only solution you can seem to come to is like, yeah, we need to save the planet, I guess. But like, what does that even mean, right? So I think there's something very unique about the sort of uh, psychological experiences we're having now in response to all of these crises, in that there's no origin point to it, and there's no sense of when it will end, right? Like colonialism was different, at least in its sort of original form, because you knew who the oppressor was, and there was a sense of, okay, if we get rid of the oppressor, then we will be liberated, right? Of course, now we know that the physical occupation of the colonizer is not where colonization ends, right? There's coloniality as sort of an epistemic condition that takes much longer, and that's still going on. But and that sort of phenomenon exists in this ambiguous frame, right? When do you know that we have been completely free of the colonizing spirit, right? When are we truly decolonized? We don't know, right? And it leaves you in this place where you feel incredibly helpless because you don't know what's going to happen, and also you're sort of locked in these sort of conflicting ideas of what might be the cause of the pain, and am I really feeling the pain if it doesn't really have a cause? And we see this a lot with people experiencing major mental health crises. Like I myself am bipolar, where like every now and then I'm just like, am I really bipolar, or is it just what the psychiatrist said to me? And then I have my own metrics for like figuring it out. And going back to the question of, science does work. I take my medication every day and I feel like a saner person for it. In the days I don't take it, I'm not a sane person. So I guess that's my answer, right? That's how I know I have a condition. But I guess that's really what the idea of ambiguous loss was. And I guess it points to a deeper sort of issue in all of this, right? Like as a society, and this is more and more the case nowadays because of the capitalist frameworks, we have a orientation towards a thingification, right? Everything needs to be consolidated into an entity. We're very bad as a population at holding uncertainty, right? To the point that we've, in a lot of cultures, we have even wrapped up uncertainty into a human-like figure, like a God figure, right? God is the all-encompassing whatever, right? Which is great for certain people who believe in that sort of thing. But we realize that nobody can really just hold on to that uncomfortable feeling of something being unstable, of something being unresolvable. And I think ambiguous loss as an idea points to that. We're really bad at this. And I think that might also point to why we're feeling these overwhelming feelings, right? Because on some level, these things are never going to go away. We're not going to get some tangible sense of closure around the climate crisis. It's just going to live in your body. And I really wonder how this is going to travel downstream with our children and stuff like that. But they'll be burning because the temperature will be really bad. So I don't think they'll care. But that's kind of what I was trying to get at.
Val, did you have any more to add to that, or should I jump on to the next one, which I had questions for?
I think Prateek summarized very well. We can move forward so we can get through your questions.
Yeah. To be fair, I could combine the last two into one, and you guys can go on about it. So you guys mentioned two terms. One was anthropocentric bias. We kind of touched upon it a little bit, but I kind of guess I'm trying to make the connection between what we discussed and the actual term. If anybody goes from here and reads the article. And the other one was the privilege to heal. I think those two would be nice things to kind of discuss and end on in terms of the episode. So I guess take it away if you could go through the two of them.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways these terms are things that we've inadvertently been talking about before we even started asking these questions. This idea that like a lot of what the foundations of these disciplines have been focusing on is for, again, a very specific type of human, and also a very specific type of population and geography. And in terms of the privilege to heal, that kind of came by by accident. We were just talking about privileges in general, and what it means to like have these disproportionate. Well, actually, you know what it was? Because I'm thinking about when we were writing it. It was we started out by trying to write these AI stories, like these AI written stories about experiencing trauma in like this like mass climate change event because we were curious about like the bias. First of all, I was curious about what the bias would be, but second of all, just like wanting to create a narrative without ourselves being involved in it because that felt really problematic. But just letting the computer do its thing. And we started out with these stories about like just like a guy, like someone from Western society that's living in like Kansas or something, and then someone who's like we're saying like actually drowning in it, experiencing like physical pain. Someone who is like part of one of those quote unquote third world countries. And when I was reading through it, it just was so cringy for many reasons, of course, as anyone would expect an AI bot to write about. But like, it just made me realize also that like, it really is like the meme first world problems. Like, you start to see like what people are grieving over, like, and I've definitely been victim to this myself where it's like I will cry when I see something on my phone. I will feel very upset. I'm like I need to take a break from like looking at the news. And everyone's done this. Like it's really hard to be witness to these things. But like we can just turn off our phones and like keep going. We can do yoga, we can meditate, and we can like tell each other like, oh, like just take a break, like the world's terrible, like go take a walk and like like that is healing and like that is a privilege because again, not everyone can just turn off their phones and do those things. And when the AI bot revealed that even more so, I was like, it is not a good idea for us to include these stories. But I think it did emerge from that process when we were writing because in doing that, it kind of unveiled a little bit of our biases too. Like we are getting, at least I was getting very emotional about certain things. About the experience of witnessing, but it's literally a first world problem. Like, okay, and like these people are like, aren't these people's problems a little bit more magnified and they don't have that privilege as much as we do? But yeah, I think to speak to that second point, if people are curious what that means, that's kind of the origin of like that term and what we often see now in these self-care rituals that are getting glorified and monetized, frankly. Like that's a whole other thing that we could talk about. But like yoga classes, meditation, like these $500 workshops to heal yourself, like taking ayahuasca and like stripping your ego, like just these things that like that's cool if you do them, but like I think that does deserve a conversation in itself in witness to these other things we were trying to talk about.
Yeah, I like if just to add to that, I mean, we should clarify that we're not trying to belittle anybody's sort of psychological experiences, right? Like these are hard times. It's very hard to be a human being. But like let's think about it, right? Like right now you have students in America protesting because there are literally children being murdered. But then there are also populations who say the Jewish kids are feeling unsafe. And I feel like bringing both of those ideas into the same conversation is the problem here, right? We're equating actual death, actual physical loss of life, livelihood, homes, land to discomfort. Um, which is not to say that that's not a bad thing. Like I'm sure you're feeling uncomfortable, and that's, it's maybe igniting generational sort of logic, like generational trauma that you may have had because of past experiences in your ancestry, but it's not the same thing. It's really not the same thing. And one of the most interesting things that Lily actually pointed out to us again was that in our entire conversation, we kept saying planetary this and planetary that, but we kept thinking about human suffering. Like, what about the experience of the more than human world? Like I mean, right now we live on a planet where most of the fauna are domesticated. We don't really have that much natural biodiversity left, right? What does that drama feel like? What does it feel like to have your entire habitat taken away because we logged the hell out of it because we wanted to, I don't know, build an installation at Burning Man? Like you know what I mean, right? Like it's these weird dynamics where we keep centering human pain and a specific kind of human pain, right? And like, what about the planet? What about the experience of the planet? There's a lot of times where people are like, oh, no, 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 the planet can survive. The planet has survived for billions of years. You know, all of us are going to die, but the planet will be fine. But I'm just like, it's not that simple. Massive populations are going to die. There are going to be entire eco. I mean, we talk about climate change itself as an issue that's going to disadvantage human beings. But sure, it is. But we are destroying these other creatures and their entire livelihoods. So, like, I guess that's kind of what we were trying to point at. And just to sort of close this discussion, I know this conversation has sort of gone all over the place, but that's really what we were trying to get at. Grief is a systemic thing, right? Instead of diagnosing individual cases and trying to solve for individual cases, which is how pharmacology seems to work right now, and even these sort of like Val was mentioning, these monetized healing practices, like you just need to meditate and become one with yourself and all that shit. Like that's sure you're going to feel better for the evening, but that's not really going to solve the real issue, right? Like if I've broken my leg, I could take a painkiller, but that's not going to make my leg heal, right? And that's kind of what we're doing, even in terms of how we're dealing with grief right now and the sort of mental health crisis around the world and all of these related things. We just try to negotiate that uncomfortable experience. We're not dealing with it systemically, and we're not thinking about what this is going to do to the future. Like, let's think about this another way. What about the pain of the future, of the people that live in the future? Are we not going to consider that? Because so many of our actions today are going to affect them, right? Like, we keep complaining about the generations before us, you know, that you guys fucked shit up for us. And like Greta's out there doing the good work for all of us, telling them, you fucked the planet up for us, right? We're probably doing the same thing for future generations. And I think these are big questions and these are hard to make sense of. But I wonder how even our academic frameworks might shift if we actively try to acknowledge and center these experiences and decenter our own, you know?
Very well put. This has been an episode of Mini Rants.
Yeah, yeah.
But very important ones. Nonetheless, very important ones. Um, be purely because of time, let's end with asking the two of you. First let's ask the two of you. Where can people read your work? Where can they reach out to you if needed? And what they can expect from your work in the let's say the next 4, 5, 6 months.
So we kind of touched about what our future goals are. We're pretty expansive at this moment. We're considering a lot of avenues beyond just publication. So I think if you are maybe if you read the article and you hear us ranting and you kind of identify with that or feel like your research aligns in some way, we love to take people who are passionate that simply even just want to be a part of the discussion. And then we kind of work as a collective. So it's not really like Prateek and I telling anyone what to do specifically. It's more coming with an idea, pitching it, and then we sort of as collective support each other in that way. So with that being said, we're very open-ended. And Prateek, do you want to sort of share how to reach out to us? That's probably best.
Yeah, I mean, you can find us on junglepublics.com, which leads to our Substack right now, but that's sort of our home base for the timing, and I think that might be the best place to reach out to all of us. And to give you sort of a taste, we also have an Instagram, which is, I think, instagram.com/jungle.publics. I think that's what it is. But I guess in terms of what we plan to do moving ahead, I mean, there are lots of different things we're working on right now. We mentioned the residency as one thing, and we've talked about doing a podcast series, a sort of limited podcast series of our own. But in terms of some of the ideas we're exploring, I mean, the grief work is one sort of angle, and that itself is sort of forking out into many things. On one hand, we're trying to think about social codes and rituals and understanding whether the rituals we've had in the past to make sense of these feelings of mental dysregulation. Maybe they're either inadequate or maybe we've forgotten them. Something about rituals and social codes that we're very interested in, we're trying to think about. And that's a whole sort of research project that we're working on right now with a lot of colleagues from the UK, Netherlands, and here in India. And at the same time, Val's working on this piece about thinking about Ozempic in a systemic way and understanding what that does in terms of all sorts of things. Questions about perception, questions about what sort of social value you have, questions about how these manifest in pharmacology and what we really consider as being healthy or fit. You'll notice that a lot of ideas that we discuss touch the scientific, touch the sort of touch like really material questions of healthcare and stuff like that. But at the same time, we do venture out into the larger immaterial world. We touch into a lot of concepts from the humanities and specifically from anti-colonial discourses. And I guess this is an open invitation to other people that if this is the sort of thing you want to do, and we understand that this is a difficult thing to do, our ambition is to hold space for those sorts of slightly ambiguous, uncertain conversations with the sense that, we're not going to resolve anything. But at least if we begin to build the capacity to hold it, maybe we might over time, develop like a new sensory ability or something like that. I don't know, but we've done a lot more in a lot less time in the past. Even if you just think about how quickly we shifted as a society after COVID, right? Who would have thought that everybody would be so okay doing everything virtually and having these meetings, right? And now it's second nature. So you never know, and that's kind of the direction we're trying to head at.
Incredible. Well, thank you guys. Very last question, which we ask all our guests. So both of you can take turns at this. If you have one piece of advice for our listeners, what would it be? Probably the toughest question of them all.
That is so hard. Like thinking.
Yeah. Okay, I can try. I think my advice to our listeners is to become better listeners, I think. Because I think at the root of this crisis, and really at the root of even the questions you're talking about in academia, is that we don't listen, and we don't listen deeply enough, and we have many biases in how we listen. We have these filters in our mind, right? And I think, if you can get better at listening and being mindful of when your own bias enters the conversation, listening without the intention of responding, but listening with the intention of trying to make sense, like doing it in trying to sort of have a relationship with what the person is saying. I think that's a sort of skill we need today. That's probably much more useful. Like that would be my advice.
That's a really good one, and played off of listeners, which is why I was giggling.
You want to listen further, follow us. Follow, subscribe, do all those things, support us.
That's how you become the best listener, actually, is by subscribing, contributing to the Patreon. I think, okay, something I've been thinking about a lot, this will be my piece of advice, is that self-authenticity is probably one of the most radical forms of protest. So really digging deep and doing the things that you're scared of because they feel right to you, but maybe are misunderstood at the time. Do it and follow the trail.
Awesome. Great pieces of advice. So thanks guys for coming on. That was really fun. I know we could have spoken about a lot more things and gone in a lot more detail. Sorry for rushing you guys at the end. But yeah, need to stay true to form and keep the episodes under an hour and a half is what it is.
Fair.
Hopefully you guys can come back on. I look forward to the next few pieces, and then we can talk about those ones and delve deeper.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. This was great. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this was
thanks
so much
everyone for
fun.
listening. So yeah, take care, guys. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.